20 scenario-based interview questions for a software engineer. Scenario number 1. You are working on a project with a tight deadline, and one of your team members is unable to complete their tasks on time. How would you handle the situation? I would first assess the situation by discussing with the team member to understand the cause of the delay. If they need help, I'd either offer assistance or allocate another team member to support them. If the delay is unavoidable, I would prioritize the most critical tasks and adjust timelines accordingly, keeping stakeholders informed. Scenario number 2. You notice that the application you are working on has started running slower than usual. How do you approach debugging this issue? I would start by identifying the areas where performance is lagging using profiling tools like cProfile, PySpy, or Visual VM. Then I would look for inefficient code paths, heavy database queries, or unoptimized algorithms. After identifying bottlenecks, I would refactor or optimize the code and monitor performance. Scenario number 3. You are tasked with integrating a third-party API into your application, but the API's documentation is unclear. What would you do? I would reach out to the API provider for clarification on documentation or ask for help. I would search for community-driven resources like Stack Overflow or GitHub issues to gather more context. If the documentation is still unclear, I'd experiment with the API by making test calls to understand its behavior. Scenario number 4. You are asked to refactor legacy code, but some parts of the code are not covered by tests, and the system is highly complex. How would you approach this task? I would start by adding unit tests for the existing code, ensuring I understand its behavior. I would refactor incrementally, beginning with isolated components to avoid large, risky changes. After each change, I would run the tests and ensure the system works as expected. Scenario number 5. You're working with a distributed system, and one of the microservices is down intermittently. How do you troubleshoot this? I would start by reviewing logs and monitoring metrics from the affected microservice to understand the pattern of failures. I would check for network issues, resource constraints, or load balancing problems. If needed, I'd implement retry logic or a circuit breaker to mitigate failures temporarily. Scenario number 6. You are tasked with implementing a new feature, but it conflicts with an existing critical feature. How do you handle this? I would first evaluate the business impact of both features by talking to stakeholders. I would explore whether it's possible to decouple the conflicting features or implement the new one in a way that doesn't disrupt the existing functionality. If conflict is unavoidable, I would suggest a phased implementation and thoroughly test both features. Scenario number 7. Your code review feedback mentions that your code is hard to understand and lacks clarity. How do you respond to this? I would ask for specific examples to better understand the areas that lack clarity. I would refactor the code to improve readability by renaming variables, simplifying logic, and adding comments. Finally, I would request a follow-up review to ensure the changes address the feedback. Scenario number 8. A production bug is reported, but it's only reproducible in certain user environments. How do you approach fixing this issue? I would gather detailed information from the user environment, including OS, browser versions, and configurations. I would try to replicate the issue on my local machine or a staging environment. After reproducing the bug, I would debug and test a fix, ensuring it works across multiple environments. Scenario number 9. You are given a task to implement a feature that requires deep integration with a third-party tool, but you have no prior experience with the tool. How do you get up to speed quickly? I would start by reviewing the official documentation and looking for any beginner-friendly guides or tutorials. I would explore community forums, GitHub repositories, or blog posts that detail real-world examples of integrating the tool. If necessary, I would create a small prototype to test out the tool before integrating it into the main project. Scenario number 10. During a sprint, you realize that you've underestimated the complexity of a task. What steps do you take to address this? I would immediately communicate the delay to the project manager and stakeholders. I would break the task into smaller, more manageable chunks and estimate the new timeline. If necessary, I would request additional resources or adjust priorities to ensure the critical tasks are completed. Scenario number 11. You are asked to add logging to a critical system. What kind of logs would you add, and how would you ensure they don't affect performance? I would add logs for important events like user actions, errors, and performance metrics. To avoid performance issues, I'd use asynchronous logging and ensure logs are written to an external storage system for analysis. I would make sure the logs contain sufficient details for debugging without overloading the system. Scenario number. You receive a task that has ambiguous requirements and unclear specifications. How do you handle the situation? I would seek clarification from the product owner or stakeholders to define clear requirements. I would document the understood requirements and confirm them with the team and stakeholders before proceeding. If the requirements are still unclear, I would break down the task into smaller chunks and validate assumptions along the way. Scenario number. You're working on a project that is facing performance bottlenecks due to inefficient database queries. How do you approach solving the issue? I would start by analyzing slow queries using database profiling tools. I would optimize the queries, perhaps by adding indexes, rewriting joins, or reducing the data returned. I would also consider implementing caching to reduce redundant database access for frequently accessed data. Scenario number. You have been assigned a task that requires knowledge of a programming language or framework you're not familiar with. How do you proceed? I would start by learning the basics through official documentation and online tutorials. I would also explore community resources like blogs, forums, and GitHub projects for practical insights. To accelerate learning, I would write small programs or scripts to test the concepts before diving into the actual task. Scenario number. Your team has been experiencing inconsistent build failures in a CI/CD pipeline. How do you troubleshoot this? I would start by reviewing the build logs to identify patterns or errors. I would check for issues in dependencies, environment variables, or configuration mismatches between environments. After resolving the issue, I would introduce more robust tests and monitoring to prevent future failures. Scenario number. You are working with a large codebase, and it's difficult to navigate. How do you make your workflow more efficient? I would leverage IDE features such as code search, bookmarks, and intelligent refactoring tools. I would also create and maintain good documentation and run unit tests to understand the core functionality. I would ensure I follow naming conventions and design patterns to make the codebase more understandable. Scenario number. A client reports that a feature you built doesn't meet their expectations, but you believe it does. How do you handle this? I would listen to the client's feedback carefully to understand their perspective and specific concerns. I would review the feature requirements and discuss with the client to ensure mutual understanding. If necessary, I would make adjustments to the feature based on the client's feedback. Scenario number. You are working on a project that requires you to handle sensitive user data. What steps would you take to ensure data privacy and security? I would ensure sensitive data is encrypted both at rest and in transit. I would implement role-based access control and use secure authentication mechanisms. I would also perform regular security audits and comply with relevant privacy regulations such as GDPR. Scenario number. You're working on a team with multiple developers, and there are merge conflicts in version control. How do you resolve them? I would review the conflicting changes and understand the context behind each. I would communicate with the other developers involved to ensure the best solution is chosen. After resolving the conflict, I would test the merged code thoroughly to ensure no issues are introduced. Scenario number. You've implemented a feature, and after deploying, you notice some edge cases that were not covered in the tests. How do you handle this? I would first identify the edge cases that were missed and reproduce the issue. After debugging and fixing the edge cases, I would write new unit tests to cover these scenarios. I would then run the tests again and deploy the fix after confirming everything works. These 20 scenario-based questions assess a software engineer's problem-solving abilities, technical knowledge, communication skills, and approach to real-world development challenges.